Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast exploring life-changing career moves. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the bold decisions that transform their careers and lives. Let's dive in. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. Today, we have a guest whose story is all about clarity, purpose, and reinvention. He's someone who didn't just step away from a high-powered executive role, he fired himself. With over 20 years of experience at major media and telecom companies, and after leading large teams and managing billion-dollar P&Ls, Timm Chiusano made the decision to walk away and follow a mission he felt deeply passionate about. His journey is one that touches on the power of self-reflection, personal growth, and the impact of helping others become their best selves. Today, we're talking about why he left, how he found his own purpose, and what's next in his life as a content creator, entrepreneur, and soon-to-be author. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Timm Chiusano, a highly respected former marketing and branding executive who recently made waves with his decision to leave his corporate role after more than a decade at a large telecommunications company. Throughout his 11 years there, he built and led a 240-person creative team, managed $30 million P&Ls with precision, and helped generate billions in advertising revenue. But after realizing his deeper purpose was to help others do their best work by being their best selves, Timm chose to walk away. Now he's inspiring over 1 million followers through his raw, transparent content on TikTok and Instagram, sharing valuable lessons on life, leadership, and creativity. He is also working on his upcoming book, How to Get Addicted to Appreciation, and I'm really excited to dive into his incredible journey today. So please welcome Timm Chiusano to the show. Timm, how you doing?
What's up, Brian? How are we doing today, brother?
I'm doing very well. Well, before we kind of get started, I just want to say one thank you for connecting. I came across your content on TikTok and eventually Instagram, and I always love it when the algorithm is showing all of us some love and putting people in my feed that really resonate with some of the things that I'm doing. So shout out to the algorithm for putting us in touch. Now, one of the things I noticed is you have this really impressive 20-year plus career. You got stints at large media companies and most recently at a big telecom company. So what initially drew you to the world of marketing and creative services, and how did it really shape your early career?
It's funny. The answer to that is, I don't know. I didn't graduate from college. Getting out of school, and I was just writing about this before jumping on here. I was doing stuff like working in, lobbies at Midtown buildings as elevator operator, and I was a substitute teacher, and really all I knew directionally was that I wanted to do something sports and I wanted to do something on the production side initially. I wanted to stay away from sales. I wanted to stay away from radio in particular, which I know is very specific, but my dad had a radio background. It's kind of like, what your dad did, you don't want to do kind of thing.
Right.
And that's all I knew. I did a little bit of marketing back in the day for a not-for-profit company called Giving Opportunities for Others, something that my friend had just started, but this was like, everybody is fresh out of school, or everyone's in their early 20s, I should say, because I was not fresh out of school at that point, and just putting different parts and pieces together, right? And marketing was always interesting just because it was creative, and I loved the idea of making commercials, which I wouldn't get to until further down the road. But I never chased that in particular. But I don't know if you recall, or if you're old enough to remember, there was a VHS game, like literally a game that you would put and start with a VHS player, and then use prompts from the video to play this board game. It was called Commercial Crazies. And it would take the old school FedEx spots and the old school, Burger King ads and that kind of stuff. And it would create not trivia, but almost, can you find the detail, or do you remember this nuance of the commercial? And it would play a bunch of them back to back and then ask you questions. So I was just always attracted by short form creative expression, I'll call it, and then sports in general, because what person that plays sports in school or some sort of above high school level, below pro level doesn't say, oh, I would love to work in sports if I'm not going to be an athlete. So it was really as simple as that directionally. And I wasn't smart enough to know, like, here's exactly what I want to do, or here's the path that I want to go down. It was like, all right, cool. Like, let me see what I can get my hands on. Let me do the best that I can with it. And then, evolve along the way and let things like getting married and having a daughter, help guide me in some capacity about how much do I want to travel, and how much do I really care about the name on my business card versus the opportunity that I get, relative to the company and that kind of stuff. And really just kind of continue to fumble through it throughout. And yeah, it helped land in some pretty neat spaces, especially the time of ESPN and the 7 years of working on the integrated marketing teams there. But that was really just a combination of being a consumer with a really specific eye relative to what I thought good creative expression was and how do you make the most of what a good brand could or should be, and connecting to an audience and finding them in a place where you can be empathetic to where they are, and that can be as simple as they're watching a really intense playoff game, and therefore you need to be aware that you're talking to a sports audience in a very specific mindset versus where they might be watching a news program or a serious documentary or something else along those lines. And just try to be thankful for literally every door that opened and do the best that I could with it, but never thinking like, oh cool, long-term aspiration would be to become a vice president of production and creative services at a Fortune 100 company. Like, never, didn't even know that that job existed back in the day.
Yeah.
So you just kind of make it up as you go.
No, I like that. And can you talk a little bit about you've led a lot of large teams, you've managed billion-dollar P&Ls in the telecom space. Can you talk about a little bit about that and how did this time in your professional life kind of influence your approach to not only leadership, but also business strategy?
I mean, it goes back to what I saw when I would be on the other side of business strategy. And when you would get those emails and it's like, hey, the department's getting restructured for X, Y, and Z reasons, and this goes back to previous companies that I'd worked at before, being at the telecom company, and always just kind of taking notes in regards to if I'm ever given a chance to do stuff like that, or if I ever have to be in a position where I'm going to oversee a large team, build a large team, explain reorgs, explain like all those what would I do differently based off of when I saw things back in the day that would raise questions in my head about, like, did they actually take the time to understand what the coordinator role did, and did that have an impact on why we landed with just one at the end of a reorg when we had seven going into it? And you know is or was that just like, oh, that feels like low hanging fruit relative to a restructure piece? And as you gather and as you collect experiences along the way, I think the more you can help yourself be molded by them with that obvious word of curiosity in your back pocket, and also make yourself promises too about, if I'm given a chance to oversee a large team, this is the way that I want to do it. And whether that's learning through experiences of bad bosses or experiences of amazing bosses, we all recall and can speak fondly of those teachers that made a large impact in our lives, right?
Right.
I think we can do the same for bosses, but unlike teachers, we can actually stick at least little parts and pieces of what we learn, good or bad, in our back pockets and then apply them. Where most people are not going to be like, cool, this is how I'm going to become a teacher, right? You can
Right.
take some of those learnings and maybe apply it to parenting or maybe apply it to something else, at a higher level. But the interesting part about growing your career in corporate America is that you can literally be like, yes, 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 no, 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 relative to these things that I'm seeing about people that I'm working for. And I just try to keep that checklist in my back pocket along the way, on the off chance that I would be given an opportunity to do some of those things for other people. And walking into the role, the last role that I had, I was 35, walked into this job. I found out the second day before my first day that I was going to have to fire a 100-person department within my first
Oh,
6 weeks and start the department from scratch. They
wow.
literally brought me in. I was like, "Hey, cool! This job is so important. They're bringing me in the Thursday before my first day to talk to me about it. And look at this big jump I'm making at 35 to go up to an executive level role and blah blah blah." And they're like, "Hey, this is what's really going to happen." I remember being like, "Oh my god, this is you know." Contemplated going back to ESPN and pulling the ripcord from that situation, but I didn't. And one of the things that I took with me going into that was not just what did I learn, see, want to do, not want to do relative to the people, that had influenced me as bosses going, into that phase of my career, but also how do I become very understand how do I show that I can be very understanding very quickly to a large group of people that are going to literally think that I walked in day one was like, I have it all figured out, right? You're handed those business plans and you're told, hey, go execute this. If you walk in, you're like, hey, this wasn't my idea, but blank, right? Like, you're just deflecting immediately. You're not showing true ownership. You need to be very cautious with how you would use something like that. So I had to own that. And so, with all those things in mind, and back to your question of what is the impact or what was the influence or inspiration for, doing some of those things or kind of getting through it, and what could somebody else kind of glean from my experience? It's one of the most underrated perspectives that I think a boss can have is the simple thought of what do I need to do so that as often as humanly possible, as many people from my team as humanly possible at the end of any given day can say, today was a good day. What do I need to do to make that happen? Right? Because if you can make that happen, they're not bored, they're not grossly overworked either. They have a fair amount of reasonable work on their desks. They understand their purpose and their direction. They have, an opportunity that they think to make potentially a difference. And it's like that is a fine answer to have on a consistent basis.
Yep.
Because I think outside of that, it is, you're like, well, wouldn't you want them to be? No, if they could literally sit down at any given meal as often as possible, and someone's like, hey, how was your day? They're like, yeah, today was a good day. That's going to take care of so many OKRs and KPIs and all that kind of good stuff. So, I mean, especially after 11 years that started with that story of, hey, it's your second day before your first day. Surprise, this is what you're walking into.
Yeah.
With all that in mind, like I could speak endlessly on the topic of, leadership and what goes into all those things. But, one of the biggest takeaways that I would want anybody to be able to pull anytime they heard a conversation that I was having with somebody, on the broader topic is, how often can you get a large team and a majority of the large team to think today was a good day? Then I think, when people potentially even scoff at that, but it's like, sorry, it's simple, but it also means you get your org chart set up well and your P&L's running well, and people kind of get things, and you probably don't have a toxic environment. So yeah, I'm going to keep it as simple as that.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I'm sure having that type of philosophy also builds respect, right, both ways, and
Totally,
so that's got to be huge, and that
totally,
is one of those things that's unseen, but as you know, you definitely need that as a leader, especially
yeah,
as an executive leader. And so now turning to this role, like you mentioned, look, it was 11 years in that space. You made the decision to fire yourself, right?
yep.
What led to that decision, and how did you know it was the right time to make such a bold move?
You don't know that it's the right time.
I appreciate that.
I'd say that there's an argument to be made that I waited too long.
Hmm.
There's an argument to be made that I could have kept going. So never the right time. And both arguments are totally valid. The argument that I left too late is a sound one because it meant that the book deal that I got was didn't get off as on the exact foot that I would have wanted it to relative to how much time and attention I could give it immediately and really jeopardize anything. But at the same time, too, is just like this extra incredible stress for a really long period of time relative to like, am I going to be able to figure this out? What are the right decisions? And, you kind of get to a spot where you almost feel like, oh, I can carry all of this stuff forever. And then you get to a point where like, this could crack at any moment. And that's not a good spot to be in. On the other side, could I also make the argument that, look, if I reconfigured things on a day in and day out basis, I could have figured it out for longer, right? Maybe you step back from making short form videos, you lean into the book, don't really need, can you simplify things across the board in a couple different ways? I could overthink it and I can make a pros and cons list for all of the above. So I think you really do not know. One of the big motivating factors that led me to, okay, this is the time, is if I didn't rip it out of my own hands, it was never going to happen. And I was too emotionally attached to the place and to a lot of the people there, where if I didn't, and thank God my wife was very encouraging of kind of the crap or get off the pot mentality, and she was like, it's time, like it's past time. She would vote that I waited too long. And I think that she's, very smart in making that argument. And so, the ability to be like, all right, I need to strategically plan for this long term versus like, hey, here's my 2 weeks, Godspeed. And so it took about a full year to do it the right way. And it was stair step because I had, 240 people. How do I take what was two sides of a production and creative services department and get that handled the right way? They weren't going to backfill my role. How do I start to emotionally remove myself from some of this as well, especially going back to how this all started and, just having to take the team apart and then put it back together? How do I like make sure that everybody's got a good safe space and maybe even do so in a stair step way so that I can kind of watch things while I'm still there? Well, if I give all of these responsibilities over here, how does that look? How does that feel? How awkward is that going to be right away? But if I do it while I'm still there and I'm still there for another few months, but nobody knows I'm leaving yet, can I do that and then oversee it and be like, okay, cool. This is in a good spot now. Now let me start to unwind this other piece. Because I think that that gave other people more opportunity versus here's my 2 weeks, Godspeed, which would have just created chaos. Because, especially when it was 240 people, that was more than half the entire marketing department. And it was a big ass marketing department of, 400 plus. So doing that in a way that was like, okay, this is a natural progression, even if at first it felt super jarring to a lot of people of basically going to break my team into two. I'm going to take this group of people and stick it over here, kind of watch that from afar, see how things go. I'm going to start to tinker with my day to day role so that when I'm fully ready to leave, I can kind of leave that in a couple of different pieces. Then I can make the argument for take my role, take my salary, and instead of getting another, vice president of production creative services, get a director that can do this, get three managers, like whatever that, the end decision was. And I was very specific and intentional with based off of, right, especially after you go through a handful of reorgs and a handful of times where you are, having to go through that process of how do you take what you have at your disposal relative to that P&L and create the right resource deployment for a large group of people, looking at my own role that way and being like, you don't need another one of me. You could use, somebody to oversee, these top five needs that we have over here and where we have bandwidth constraints over there. And basically just kind of split yourself up and be like, here's the recipe, here's the new org chart. Wild experience to go through and literally like have meetings about, destroying your own role and what that looks like. And hey, here's the communication plan. And you go through those things as a leader, potentially several times if you're depending on any merger acquisition you go through, but you rarely, I think, do that for yourself unless you're retiring. So super surreal experience to be like underneath the hood and watch that happen and do those things literally to yourself. And throughout all that, you're going to question a million times, is this the right time? Am I making the right decision? X, Y, and Z, but I just focused on, okay, is it time from an emotional perspective and a bandwidth perspective? Do I feel like, obviously, from a financial perspective as well, that I'm in a position where this makes sense? Do I have the support from my family? And, am I excited about the potential? And then you go and do, and you fumble through that process too, and you learn along the way and see how you can be smarter about all the pieces, even if things are about to change drastically.
I love how intentional you were with that because many people struggle with leaving just pure stable jobs, right?
Yep.
And you have had a very high ranking position, so I imagine that struggle that you had there, and I appreciate you talking about how both personally and professionally it kind of impacted you and how you went through that. One of the things that I've seen you talk about is how you've become really clear on your purpose to help others really do their best work.
hmm
Can you talk more about how that realization has played into your decision to leave corporate life?
Sure. I've this very specific philosophy, maybe you could call it, that anybody can find their purpose for what they're doing currently through a really straightforward exercise. And that is you write one sentence about what you currently do that is as simple as humanly possible and as kind about the role as humanly possible as well. And I've done this exercise with people that work at ice cream shops, and I've done this with people that worked at places like Merrill Lynch for 25 plus years. And the impact that it can have on your own perspective of yourself and then what your umbrella macro skill is pretty wild. So then that's going to evolve for everybody. And especially with, what I said mine relative to the ice cream shop versus the, dude at Merrill for 25 plus years.
Right.
But it gives you this clarity of what good looks like on a day-to-day basis for you and for those that you're impacting. And it also gives you clarity on what your macro skill set is. So for that person that works at Baskin Robbins, if that sentence is something along the lines of, I help people make a good decision about a treat they're excited to enjoy, and I do so, in a clean and friendly environment to help them have a better day, right? Like that's working at an ice cream shop. People go in stoked. I'm gonna eat ice cream. Somebody behind the counter is cool and is like, "Yo, let me give you sample this. Hey, do you know we have this special?" Oh, if you like butterscotch, we got the best butterscotch, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Walk away and they're like, this was amazing. And that person was super nice. And this shop was clean. Based off of how they wrote that sentence for themselves, they've got good customer service skills. They have good self awareness, excellent attention to detail, solid understanding of product base, right? Like there's a lot of good stuff in there. What does that translate to? A lot. There's a lot of
Yeah.
jobs out there
Yes.
that would love that rounder's skill set. So for me, it evolved over time, obviously. And even in the current role, it started with I help provide the right environment for people that are creating commercials for small businesses to do X, Y, and Z. And like as I got out of the specifics of rebuilding the department and really direct intentionality of like how do we just get this one thing, this core thing that we do as crisp and as good as we can get it. And then it became like, okay, great, we've done that in large part. My role is largely keeping the lights on, as people at higher levels of their career know, like you get to a point where it's like I'm not really doing the thing anymore. My thing is to keep the lights on, make sure that people get paid well, make sure that the process makes sense, make sure that we're buying the right software and hardware and like people. And so with all that in mind, my purpose became I help people do their best work by being the best version of themselves. And I split that into two specific buckets for a reason. Doing their best work goes back to all of the things that I could have gotten into more micro detail about that I had when the role was still really building the department and all those elements were still coming together. That's the P&L, that's the process, that's the hardware and the software, that's the guts of the business. By being the best version of themselves, started to rear its head in about 2017 for me after one of the biggest merger and acquisition deals in the history of telecommunications in the country, if not the biggest ever. It had three companies coming together, and that can create chaos, especially at the scale that we're talking about. Or it can create quiet chaos in that oh, it was better when we did it this way, or our company did this, and legacy that, and blah. And there was an opportunity for me to be a part of rewriting and redeploying the company's beliefs and values. And I saw that as a critical element at the time for a multitude of reasons. And, by being the best version of yourself part, was tied to that culture and, and those values elements. And getting people to be comfortable with what they brought to the table individually, because I think that that's ultimately what's going to grow a company, over the long term, is when you get people to come in with their own unique perspectives and skill sets, and to be able to do so in a way that is, in a collaborative environment that is, a safe space that is accepting of people, failing on things because they tried new ways to do whatever it is they're looking to accomplish on a day in, day out basis. So evolving from a more specific piece to now that simple sentence for me that states things at the highest level is really about just the simple notion of doing your best work, but by being the best version of yourself along the way as well. I thought that that was the critical balance that was needed to help move the business along, but was also the most accurate description for what I was doing. And as things started to evolve in the social space, and as I started to be like, wow, this is more than I would have ever fathomed, and you start to get DMs along the lines of, you helped me be less scared of growing old. You helped me
Mm,
through my first 2 years of my career. You helped me survive the first year of being a manager. And then you get people that you work with that you're like, wow, yeah, that people work had said this for a while too, but they work for you. So you're like, okay, cool. Thanks for being nice to the boss and all the kinds of things. Take with a grain of
right,
salt.
right.
And then they're like, well, wait a minute. I've known these people for 10 plus years in some cases. And now in a broader capacity where I'm just a stranger on the internet, I'm getting, similar feedback here. And then as you start to discuss it and you start to think, okay, what's possible? And you get feedback again from people that have known you for the longest in your life. They're like, oh, this is kind of just the person we've always known. And you get a couple comments, especially from people that literally work directly for you. They're like, dude, if you could do for a million people what you've done for me over the past 5 years, like, God bless. Go get out of here. Go do that. It's going to destroy me because I don't want to, deal with what comes next. But yeah, if that's your thing, like, go do it, and I'm stoked for you. And then you just gotta then the work really begins and you gotta live up to it. And so
Yeah.
I'm fumbling through that part now and trying to figure out what is the right way to take the last 20 years that's in my head and create the right syllabus for it, and roll it out the right way. And then in that as well, like, do you say yes to a conversation like this, or do you say no, I need to go work on you know, 5 new short form pieces that are gonna help the entry level person, wrap their head around the difficult challenges of, a bad boss, or how do you raise your hand the right way when you disagree with process, or, blah, 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 blah. There's defining your purpose for yourself, and then there's how well can you actually do to bring that to life, and how can you connect those things? Because I think it's one thing to be like, cool, here's my purpose, but then the actuality of seeing it come to fruition is a whole nother ball of wax. And, God, does that create some potential, confusion and consternation and all the things all over again. But it is definitely cool when you've got clarity on it. Now I just got to try to do it the right way.
Yeah. No, and I really can relate to that because I feel very similar in not only the things I do professionally, but also what I'm doing with this show and like really providing that space for folks to help others kind of get through X situation. And so
Yeah.
I love that you're doing that. And having kind of done a deep dive on your content, it really comes across how genuine you are
Yeah.
about trying to help people become their best selves. So it doesn't surprise me that randoms on the internet and folks that you've worked with 10 plus years have said similar things because look, this creator space is very crowded, and you can see through a lot of, yeah, you can see when someone has lived it and they're speaking from experience,
Hmm.
as opposed to someone who's really, nothing wrong with faking it till you make it, but you
Yeah,
see folks who are faking it right now.
totally.
You see the authenticity in your content. So I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
that you mentioned that, which kind of leads me into my next question around transparency, right? So you've been obviously very transparent about your decision, but one thing that really stuck out to me is you've been remarkably open about your salary
Hmm.
and your departure process on social media, which is truthfully very rare for executives, right?
Hmm.
So, what motivated you to maybe share these specific details about, uh, you know, the money you're leaving behind, and all those decisions? And how do you hope this transparency impacts others in similar positions?
Great question. I don't hope that it impacts others in similar positions. My hope is that it impacts those that are not in similar positions that are trying to wrap their head around, well, where the hell does my career potentially go?
Mm,
Like what kind of money is out there to be made? There's I can see it being wildly confusing for the younger generations that are seeing headlines of CEOs that are making 50, 70, 100, million dollars on an annual basis, and other people in suits running around, and then all of the news relative to where minimum wage is at and which companies are fair in what regard, and that's a lot to process, right? So far less for, like, if it helps anybody, amazing. For the selfish part of it is, I now don't have anything that, unless you find something specific within that you disagree with, there's nothing from a trust perspective that I think I could further offer,
wow.
right? And so if people are going to be along for this ride, then I think that they deserve to know, A, they help set me free, right? Their like, their follow, their comment, their forward, all of those things put me in a position to go do this. And I think to have, as much trust as I would want to get out there, they should know what the hell am I going for, right? Because if I'm going to go grab a yacht, then screw me, right? Who
Right.
cares? I've got, like, if I can take what I've learned, keep my lifestyle in the same general ballpark as it has been, love the city that I live in, love the ability to send my kid to a good school, love the ability to order, you know, have sushi as often as I like without going to like the craziest, fanciest places. Like, I'm not I'm not here to like try to be the next, with all due respect. I'm not here to be like the next Gary Vee, or here to be the next, person that's going to be like, cool, I'm having this 3-day event, with this thing and blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't, it's not my jam. And so I think to help explain that is full transparency. I think, especially when you've worked for a public company where, and people knew what my level was. And then if they saw what our CEO made last year, then they could be like, oh, dude probably made blah, 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 or who knows what they thought.
Right.
I also think that it's super interesting in today's space, with some of the general confusion around what does a good career look like, and also what makes for, this like elitism, or that like elitism world, and the perception of there being closed doors, X, Y, and Z. To me, it's an opportunity to say, here's the number, and for context, that's basically what you would sign a contract for if you just got drafted into the NFL at a league minimum. That's, you know, a good year would be a very mediocre middle reliever in Major League Baseball. So for me, it helped calibrate, like, when people are like, how is this dude doing all these things? It's like, been working my ass off, and here's what my compensation was. It also helped be like, look, if you want to say, hey, this guy's hobnobbing and doing blah, 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 it's like, it's fine. Like, everyone can have their own perception of me as they may see fit. But if you're ragging on me, then you're also ragging on that middle reliever that, is trying to be like, cool, just give me like, you know, maybe 2 or 3 innings, 2 or 3 times a week, until my left arm falls off and then like, send me out to the pastures kind of jam. And, also help to create this transparency or at least a barometer relative to CEOs are making this. What does it look like if you get to quote higher middle management, right? And what could that potentially look like? And then also from a trust perspective, so that people would be like, all right, now I get it. So what I would want to throw in there with that answer is the compensation is one piece. What I haven't spoken of too much, but is out there, is I took every one of my performance reviews from the past 11 years and redacted them based off of things that just shouldn't be in the public space from either a numbers perspective or a names perspective, or and those are available online too. So if like for people that actually trust, because to your point earlier, fake it till you make it, and the people that are just making like, okay, I'm just going to Google what are the things you should ask in response, at the end of an interview, kind of stuff. Amazing, dime a dozen right now. Like there's a lot of people out there that are having those kinds of, and some of it's super helpful, and all that matters is what the viewer sees and how helpful it is to them. But to build long term trust and for people to be like, okay, I'm going to see things differently. I'm not going to make the TikTok that's like, hey, here's how you negotiate your salary from 60 to 65K. I'm going to tell you a story of how I never negotiated my salary, and here's why. Here's where it ended up. Some of that could just be based off of circumstances. Some of that could be based off of just inherent privilege that I get to bring to the table. Some of that could be based off of circumstances based off of the company and how they, but you can take all that with a grain of salt. Not that I expect people to go and do the research and be like, well, how much did this dude make and what was his performance review in 2015?
Right.
But to be like, I got nothing to hide, both from how much I made, what my aspirations are, and then how did people really think about what my work was behind the scenes throughout the course of my career. And I'm ready to have a serious ass conversation that you're going to hear in a very different way from anybody else that's having this conversation. With all those things in mind, I think that the only thing I need to sell anybody on is trust.
Yep.
And if I can get them to fully trust me, and I think that it requires that type of transparency in today's world to be like, no, you can really trust me. And then if you do, then that's, I think, inherently just going to mean good things for me and my family along the way. But I'm very sincere about that because it's very easy, especially with content creation being as you know more easily accessible, and you could get a good camera and you could even hire some people to make things look super cool, and all of a sudden you're an expert. I would rather be like, I'm using my phone and I'm editing on iMovie, and here's what my boss has said about me over the last 11 years. Here's how much I made, and here's where I'm looking to go. And if you want to come hang out and let me help you as much as I possibly can, and understand that I'm going to make mistakes along the way relative to should this have been a podcast versus a YouTube, and should I write this article versus, like all that kind of stuff, and make some gaffes and normal errors along the way too, then I think that's going to make for a super fun ride and a super
Yeah.
interesting story. And also at the end of the day too, if I can have my wife and daughter look at me and be like, You did it the right way, and you know, and you kept the wheels on the bus, and you know, created a super fun world for us," then that's all I could ask.
Winning, winning, winning. Right. I
Yeah.
like that. And so that's a perfect kind of transition into now this creator space that you're stepping into. So you go from corporate exec, now you're this very highly influential content creator. Like I mentioned earlier, you got over a million followers across these platforms. So what you think, let's talk a little bit about, the inspiration to make this leap, and how has your creative process evolved through platforms like TikTok and IG?
Yeah, man, I was making it up for so long that I'm still figuring that out.
You and me both.
Right? I mean, like, my strategy before I left was capture as much vertical video during the day as possible and edit it, on the subway for the most part, and then make up the voiceover the next morning, hope that it's decent, post it that afternoon, hope that it performs well, and rinse and repeat. And that's really all that there was. Podcast sounds interesting because I am genuinely a long winded dude, as you're seeing in real time. Cool. Sprinkle some of that stuff in. My heart has always been with 16 by 9, just, as a dude born in 1977 who's, you know, never even contemplated the thought of shooting vertically or, consuming content vertically until, the advent of Vine and TikTok came along. And just really fumbled my way through those first handful of years, but love the process so much that it was easy to make. I should say easier than most would want to ever consider, making 2,000 or so pieces of content over the past 5 years. So that the process was just keep the wheels on the bus, make something every day as much as possible. A, because I loved it. B, because I knew the consistency was critical. And there was a ton that I could learn about myself and about others along the way as well. And since I left, it's been a heavier focus on how do I really earn that trust back that we just discussed, because I'm not just going to be like, cool, here's a day in the life for the 500th time in a row of the dude that left his job and is now, sitting in a Mets sweatshirt on a podcast and look, isn't this cool, and check out this lifestyle kind of thing. So trying to invest in both time and, from a outside resource perspective, how do I just create, as big of a batch of evergreen, useful, career specific content as humanly possible? And right now I'm really in the early phases of, like, you got to make 50 different versions of a chocolate chip cookie until you get the right chocolate chip cookie. And then you're like, cool, this is the recipe. Now go make 1,000 of these and see how well they do out there once everybody gets a chance to try them. So I'm really in that. I've got 8 different kinds of chocolate chip cookie recipes in front of me, like which one makes the most sense, so that I can take, you do the AMAs on Instagram and you get all of these amazing questions. But how helpful is that truly at scale when it's just like, hey, here's a one off? So doing things like, you know, going through my LinkedIn and taking all the DMs that I've gotten over the past however many months and putting them into a Word document, sending those to Chat GPT. Give me a summary of this. What are the key highlights? Especially as a one man band, how can I get smarter about, getting additional perspective and resource for simplifying the kinds of stuff that's coming my way. Then trying to bucket, like, okay, cool, like what are the verticals, like literally looking at it from a, like a business and branding perspective of, what are the key tentpole things that I should be hitting on? Do I go horizontally relative to, like, here's management 101, here's entry level 101, here's executive 101? Or do I go skill set vertical of, here are communication things that can apply to everybody, whether you're management 101 or whether you're entry level 101? And so I'm really trying to, like, sort through that right now. And I think I'm closer to, all right, if I take some of the questions that I've got, some of the topics that I see coming up on a consistent basis, what does that syllabus look like? But how do I, like, write the syllabus while also create some of the coursework at the same time, by giving cheat sheets of, here's 3 things you can do if you have a bad boss. Here are, 5 reasons why you should know what the budget cycle of your company is. And be really smart about that. Like, in an ideal world, I would have a piece of content for almost every single day like that can go out before I did anything quote unquote fun. Right. And if it's like, cool, I am living up to what my purpose was simply by every single day, or, 3, 5 times a week being like, here's something that can help for a large group of people that are probably dealing with this thing. Could it be the most viral thing ever? In most cases, no, but that's not what I'm here for. It's how useful is it? How helpful is it? How scalable and useful are those elements? So trying to sort through that, I'm going to think myself into a corner a million times over about, is this better as a podcast versus a YouTube? And since I'm shooting everything with my phones and I'm editing on iMovie and I don't have, very much kind of outside help, where does it make sense to get some of that help when the time is right? How do I keep that kind of running train of thought relative to what the syllabus is while keeping up my obligations on a book writing perspective, etc. So the focus now is really delivering the value that I think was the initial promise that I put on the table. And, but at the same time, too, not having it be such a hard pivot that it becomes unfamiliar to people based off of why they originally found me, because there is an element of, well, hey, all of these topics kind of took away from me being able to make people feel less scared about growing up anymore. And so, how do you kind of like balance that stuff out? So, foundationally, I got to get that, like, here's just the stuff that's going to be helpful. It's not sexy. I want to do it in a Mr. Rogers vibe where, like, that kind of world meets corporate America tutorial stuff. you know, Keep that other layer of, this is what people know me for, and this is where people can kind of consistently find that feeling that they've gotten from what I've done, and make sure that that's, always available. And then how do I kind of expand from there and make it either more interesting, different, showing up in places where people wouldn't expect me to show up, and really, trying to layer it through those lenses.
I like that a lot. And I'm looking forward to actually watching that as someone who is, new to your content. I'm looking forward to seeing this. I'll call, I guess, like a bit of an evolution, right? Of what it now looks like as you start putting those things together. And it's also a nice reminder for myself because, to be honest, I don't do enough vertical videos, right? I really don't. And the type of things that I put out on TikTok and IG from a show perspective are a lot of like clips. I did, dabble with some B-roll, did a voiceover, and I was like, oh, maybe I should do more of that, but then I never do, right? And
Yeah.
so it's getting me thinking about what I can do in this space to continue. I know what services I'm trying to provide, but how could I do a little bit more to help the others who are following, or the followers who are checking it out? And it's a nice transition now into, so now you're in this creator space and now you're represented by Night, right? And you
Mhm.
have an upcoming book, as we mentioned earlier, called, How to Get Addicted to Appreciation, which I love the title, by the way.
Thank you.
And can you tell us more about not only what this representation means, but how this next project reflects your mission to help others? Because I've heard
Yeah.
you mention, staying true to the book deal and what you've signed there. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the book deal is, I would say, the ultimate, manifesting of that purpose coming to life in the most scalable way possible, because the whole thing is literally this step-by-step approach to get people to look at everything differently without putting in too much effort. Almost this like passive way, think Atomic Habits meets um, you know, color correction of sorts, where it's like, cool, here's this very actionable, very useful perspective. But, and the reason why it's worked for me is that it's not a heavy lift. It's not like, oh, here are these things that I need to do to make this come to fruition. It's like, no, let's just take a second and have this conversation. And then you're not going to be able to unsee this. And how do I make that as simple and digestible and straightforward, with anecdotes along the way to keep it entertaining too? And it's fun because it hit me, I think, in like 2017 or 18. I'm like, oh, like this is a thing. Like my brain, the reason why my brain will jump from this to that, from this stressful piece to this just random thought about manhole covers or New York City subways or these. I was like, God, like it just doesn't make sense. Why is, like, I either have some sort of, whether it's ADD or like, something in that general ballpark of just going from point A to point Z without questioning it. But at the same time, too, like that's made me happier and more content and more calm and more understanding. And it's helped me be smarter about business decisions and all of these pieces. And I'm like, it's actually this just consistent form of appreciation where it is addicting in that at the times where I felt down or I felt like things are not clicking, it's been withdrawal symptoms from not having that fix of appreciating things on a consistent basis. And so that was a super fun realization, and even that much more fun when there's an opportunity to have a conversation with a literary agency about what is that idea and how does that look on paper, and can we sell that to a publisher and all that kind of good stuff. So still, 11 months out from this point is when it's going to be on bookshelves. So a lot of work to be done. First version of the manuscript is in. Now it's going to be getting into the details of all of the editing and the back and forth to refine it over the next probably 4 or 5 months before it's like, cool, this thing's locked off. They go print it, and then we're off to the races and hope people, respond to it as well as I think that they will if I do it justice. And then on the night front, that is a super fun space because that's basically the brand deals that people would see showing up in my feeds. And while that is becoming a very saturated space overall, I feel like I'm built to do it well, right? Live sports production background that transitioned into ESPN customer marketing and sales, where basically I was doing that, but for ESPN content. So instead of it being my own content, it was IBM being like, yo, we got 25 million bucks. We want to do NFL and we want to do tennis. And we want to do golf. How do we bring Watson to life? Like, how do we do these, insight center things and blah, blah. But like, all right, here's the idea is to have integrated content with brand messaging, show up in a space that's going to feel organic and straightforward and make sense to the viewer so that they are interested and actually take a next step versus being like, oh, this just doesn't belong here. This isn't the right environment for an IBM commercial in the middle of, Sunday NFL countdown. Doing that for 7 years back then, and then going and working at a company where I learned how to create content for small businesses at scale, like that's a perfect recipe for, okay, cool. Now it's, you know, X, Y, or Z footwear, you know, retail, food, whatever it is, asking me to do that unfettered, right? Here's the brief, but we trust you as a creator. What's in your head for this? I've been able to bust out some super weird idea. I mean, when Dyson came to me and they're like, hey, there's this amazing robot vacuum. We know that you love Dyson. We know that you love cleaning. You've shown 1,000 TikToks already where you're vacuuming every single day after a long ass day at the office. And I'm like, yeah, instant gratification of vacuuming. Like that's a real thing for me. Like I dig it. They're like, cool. Like let's help bring that to life. I'm like, I got it. We're gonna pretend like the robot vacuum is gonna rent the basement from me, and I'm gonna talk to it like it's a real person. And like, cool, go do it. Right? Like, how fun is that?
Yeah.
But it's genuine to who I am. It's a fun story. It's going to catch people in a different way. It's going to get them to hopefully look at the Dyson brand slightly differently, hopefully get them to consider a product if it's something that they're, in the market for in a different way and so that's fun. Like I genuinely enjoy that. I genuinely enjoy being able to be in a position where I'm like, the product is endemic. I like the brand. This feels, almost aspirational for me of like, cool, I get to collaborate with these kinds of brands. When Dyson said, hey, we want to give you access to, the guy who's basically, second in line for the company these days, get to go hang out with him for an hour, and they would trust me in that situation when, it was just kind of like, yeah, go make a piece of, no like formal, hey, here's the shot list, like just show up at the store and y'all are going to trust me. That's fun to do, right? Because that also kind of blends my ability of, can I show up in a president's office the right way, have the right conversation, behave, and position my thought and my strategy and my mind in a way that's going to garner respect and a reciprocated level of energy that creates an environment for something new and unique to actually come from that moment. That's not easy. And so I love kind of putting myself in those positions and then seeing what, like, it's I just got an email last night where a brand that I recently did work for, who also happens to be my former company, which is wild in the first place, where it was like, cool, I'm firing myself. Okay, you did. Hey, you talked about your compensation after you left. Can we have a conversation about that? Sorry, we can't. We're a publicly traded company. Like, there's a lot about us that's out there. Like, I can appreciate, and I don't love the fact that I stirred the water cooler talk, and it was probably more disruptive than I would have liked. But at the same time, too, I kind of stand by the reasons behind sharing it. And like, all right, well, will you make a TikTok for us about, our new brand messaging? Like, all right, cool, we can do that, right? Like, that's
Right.
that's wild. That's super
Yeah.
wild to me.
Yeah.
But I love that stuff. I love the opportunity to just show up in different ways. To If we're gonna have all of this marketing and all of this consumerism, smattered around everywhere, and I can help good brands that are doing good things be seen in a different way. And if that helps, do well by my family in the short term as I try to build all these things and fumble my way through the larger project of life, then I'm good with that.
I love that. And, as we move to now the advice section, I think, hearing your authenticity, hearing your own purpose, I think others who may be considering a significant career transition can really learn from you, not only from directly your content, but obviously my listeners who are tuning in as well. So what advice would you give them about finding their purpose, embracing the uncertainty that comes with it as they think about what's next?
Write that simple sentence, that highest level, kindest version of what you currently do, because that's your base level. Like, seriously, take the time to actually write that down. Don't just think about it. Like, write it down and then, mess with it. Like, mess around with the words and the order, and get it to a place where, like, yes, this is appropriate based on what I'm doing. This feels directional because it gives me this macro skill set, opportunity to talk about things in different ways. And like, once you kind of get that, then you've got the solid ground you need to stand on. And that's all you need, right? There's always going to be something that is, creating confusion or uncertainty or lack of specific direction relative to how do you get from manager to senior manager, like that kind of stuff. That's always going to be there, and it never goes away, right? You can have people that are at senior VP levels that are like, I've been here for 23 years. Like, what do I got to do to get that next C level? Like, why have I been like that happens, right? Something that hit me like a ton of bricks that at first was depressing and then it became inspiring was, oh shit, this is not going to stop. There's never like that thing where you're like, okay, cool. No, you're going to have to go if you want to get to that next level. You're going to have to go interview for those roles and you have to have those conversations and also have to be okay with the fact that you probably may not get it. And that helps, to me, that helps create clarity of what you can actually control. And that means what you are doing right now is all that matters. Because whether you find it to be the most boring and like god awful role you've ever had, you are learning through that inherently. And the skills that you have at your disposal to refine on a day to day basis, that's on you to make the most of. And then you get to walk away with that in whatever, way, shape, or form that you decide. The moment that you give the other company, the other people around you, the ownership of that, then you did just what I said. You gave them ownership of that. I love using the analogy of basketball for this because if you play for any given team, and even if you thought that the locker room environment was toxic and the ownership was crap, and your eighth losing season in a row, who is it on relative to how well your core skill set has grown or developed over that time for shooting, passing, dribbling, free throws, whatever? Who's that on? It's on the
Yeah,
player.
it's on the player. Yeah.
Why is that any different in a corporate space? Right? Like, we try to separate these things sometimes, and it becomes super easy to be like, "No, it was this, that, and the other thing," and therefore, it may not be the sexiest thing in the world to be like, "Cool, I still have a license for Microsoft Excel, and therefore I can go in and get like super good at that because that's something that is a core piece of my day to day. But guess what that does? That lets you walk away with, being able to say, Joe, you can give me anything Excel spreadsheet wise, and I can give your senior leadership clarity and understanding that will simplify things and deliver data in a way that is going to completely differentiate this company from others, because you can have a greater understanding in regards to what's underneath the hood and what really is important from a business decision perspective. And if you're cool with owning that, then I think the world's your oyster.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And, now I'll give you a chance to ask me a question. So what's one question you have for me that I could potentially answer, hopefully answer?
What's the one piece of advice that lives rent free in your head now from any of the other guests you've had on?
Kind of one of the best quotes that I've had on this show is a gentleman in season 1. And he talked about when people have life outside of work, their work comes to life. And I thought about that.
Love that.
Yeah, me too. It hit, and I made him say it twice because it hit me like in the moment. And I was like, man, that is so true, right? Because even around, like I have a very, very full-time job, right? And I'm doing things that I'm truthfully loving to do right now. But also I'm loving doing what I'm doing with the show as well. And I think what I've been able to do with the show is this quote unquote life outside of work, right?
Mhm.
That helps and at times informs even some of the things that I'm doing on the job.
Mhm.
And so it's a quote that lives with me because I've seen it start playing out, not only in my personal life, but I see it playing out in the personal lives of my guests,
Mhm.
right? And they talk about it. I mean, obviously, my show is about why people have left their jobs. And there are some folks who are starting their own things. There are some folks who are just maybe pivoting to other companies. But what they really started to figure out for themselves is what is it that they want and or need
Yep.
that's going to then help them do X thing. Like,
Mhm.
and I think about you, right? Like you're like you said, your wife may say it may have taken a little bit too long for you to make this transition, but you had started creating this life outside of work that truthfully helped even informed your current work. And I think it's very bold of you to like say, look, you don't need someone at my level. You have a director here, a couple managers here, and figuring that out. But like you really set it up in a nice way that I think was beautiful to hear. And obviously some of the things I've seen online. And so that piece of advice has stuck with me. And I feel like I'm really living that, starting to
Mm.
live it a bit more. But I'm also trying to be very intentional with that. And I always appreciate him for kind of putting that in the atmosphere because it's really helped me truthfully like ground me in some of the things that I'm doing because I want to make sure that the stuff I'm doing outside of work that I'm like, this is kind of really who I am. Right.
Yep.
And it should inform everything that I'm doing so that there's really, people talk about work-life balance. Really, it's never going to be balanced, but it's this integration that I think is really beautiful that I'm trying to accomplish. And I think we're always trying to achieve that. So that's how I would answer that one.
Totally. Love that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, Tim, I just want to thank you for coming on the show. Like I said, I'm so glad I found you online. We'll continue to follow you. Excited for the book about appreciation and would love for you to share where our listeners can find you and support you.
Look up my name, and that's basically my handle across the board. And yeah, hopefully it helps you in return. That it's not a one-way street. That if you find me and you find my stuff, that you find some usefulness in it.
No, absolutely. Well, look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Timm Chiusano for joining me today. I'll put all of his information in our show notes, and I hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Tim, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Why I Left. Join us next time for more inspiring stories about growth, resilience, and transformation. Visit us online at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the Alive Podcast Network. See you soon.